Hi, my name is Eric Segerstrom, and I'm a senior electrical engineering major at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. Today I will be speaking about some preliminary work that I performed this summer in modeling a 1 degree of freedom dual rotor system using system identification processes and methodologies. I'd like to begin this presentation by briefly discussing the motivation behind modeling a simple aerospace system, after which I'll speak about some of the equipment and software that I used to perform this research, specifically the Quanser AERO system and the system identification toolbox created by MathWorks for MATLAB and Simulink. I'll then cover the general workflow of black box system identification, from acquiring the input and output data of a system to estimating candidate models for the simulated system to evaluating those models in real time. Finally, I'll discuss my results and briefly speak about how I plan on expanding this research during the upcoming semester. So why model a simple aerospace system? For a wide variety of applications, there's a growing interest in unmanned aerial vehicles, or UAVs, and electric vertical takeoff and landing vehicles, or eVTOL vehicles. For example, some companies are beginning to use drones for cargo transport. The picture on the left is of an eVTOL vehicle used by DHL in a 2013 experiment to deliver a small quantity of medicine. In some cities, UAVs are being used for passenger transport, with companies like Uber currently offering aerial ride-sharing in 3 cities around the world. UAVs have also been used extensively for agricultural applications, such as crop spraying and the monitoring of livestock. The more ubiquitous that these vehicles become, the more important it is to be able to safely and efficiently study their dynamics by developing accurate models and simulations of them. In this work, my goal was to estimate an adequate black box model for a simple 1 degree of freedom system. I know adequate is a somewhat vague term, but in this scenario, I was attempting to estimate a model whose output would closely resemble the measured output of the system without incorporating any a priori knowledge into the model. The principles used to model this simple system can also be applied to the estimation of models of more complex systems, such as the ones that I described previously. The system that I modeled in this work was a Quanser AERO dual-rotor experimental benchtop system. While the AERO can be configured to function as a 2 degree of freedom system, I only utilized it in its 1 degree of freedom configuration in order to keep the estimated model as simple as possible. In this configuration, the system is only able to rotate about the pitch axis, limiting the number of measurements that needed to be accounted for. The AERO is also compatible with MATLAB and Simulink, and it even comes with some Courseware modules and pre-built Simulink models that were a helpful starting point for this work. In order to estimate models for the AERO, the system identification toolbox developed by Lennart Ljung and others for MathWorks was used extensively. This toolbox contains functions for MATLAB, blocks for Simulink, and a system identification app. The system identification app pictured here provides a convenient and efficient method to import and pre-process measured data and estimate and evaluate a variety of candidate models without having to worry about the fine details of how each model is structured. Additionally, after a model has been estimated, it can be exported back to the MATLAB workspace to work with further. While the app is configured to estimate a pretty wide variety of model structures, in this work I only utilize transfer function models, state space models, and polynomial models. I'd like to speak briefly now about the general process of system identification and how I applied each step to the hardware and software that we discussed previously. For black box model estimation, where no a priori knowledge is assumed, the only data that affects the model are the measured input and output signals of the system. The Quanser AERO in its 1 degree of freedom configuration is a SISO, or single input, single output system. This means that there's only 1 output signal and 1 input signal to measure. The Simulink tool pictured here was developed to acquire a data record for 3 variants of input signals. In this work, the input signal measured was the voltage applied to both rotors of the system, and the output signal measured was the rotation of the system body about the pitch axis in radians. At the left of the model are the 3 input signals that were used in this work. From top to bottom, there are a pseudo-random binary sequence, a sum of signs signal, and a Gaussian noise signal. Each of these input signals were fed to a variable established in the MATLAB workspace, a scope to monitor the input signal, and a hardware-in-the-loop block to feed the input signal to the Quanser AERO. Another hardware-in-the-loop block is used to record the output signal to another variable in the MATLAB workspace. So once a data record is obtained, the next step of system identification is to utilize parametric and non-parametric identification methods to determine a set of candidate model structures. In this work, the System Identification Toolbox app was used for this step to quickly estimate models and observe how closely the output of the model fit the measured output as the mean of the measured output. Pictured here is the model output window of the System Identification Toolbox app for the pseudo-random binary signal input applied to the Quanser AERO. 4 estimated model outputs are displayed here with their similarity to the measured output described as a percentage on the right-hand side. In this case, while all the model outputs are fairly similar, it's easy to see that the Box-Jenkins polynomial model at the top of that list fits the measured output the best. So the potentially final step of system identification is to evaluate the estimated model for its adequacy. The Simulink tool pictured here was developed to quickly evaluate several estimated models. The low-frequency sine wave generator at the left of this tool feeds an input signal simultaneously to both the Quanser AERO and the estimated model. The block at the bottom of this tool is an ID model block that can be configured to simulate any candidate model that's stored as a state space, linear gray box, polynomial, transfer function, or process model in the MATLAB workspace. Both outputs are then fed to a scope so that the accuracy of the model can be visually evaluated by comparing the output of the model to the measured output of the system. If the model is determined to be adequate for its application, then the system identification process is complete, and the selected model can be used for simulation or other applications. Otherwise, the procedure should be re-evaluated for potential weak points that may have led to an inaccurate model, such as poor input signal design, an incorrect sample time, or poor model structure selection. In this work, it was determined that the output from an auto-regressive integrated moving average Box-Jenkins polynomial model best fit the measured output of the Quanser AERO. As you can see, the trajectory and amplitude of the model output closely follows the measured output. However, you can also observe a pretty big discrepancy in phase or frequency between the two outputs. Because of this discrepancy, this likely wouldn't be an adequate model, but due to the time constraints afforded to this project, I wasn't able to estimate a more accurate model. I will, however, be continuing this work in the fall, and I hope to quickly address this issue. That being said, in the Simulink courseware provided by Quanser, a gray box model of the AERO that's pictured here is estimated. Rather than estimating a model entirely from measured input and output data, the model that Quanser provides is developed from a combination of measurements and a priori knowledge. As you can see, the provided model explicitly considers things like thrust constants, natural frequency, and viscous damping, all of which are highlighted in yellow. So utilizing the same validation tool that was previously described, it can be observed that while the output of the gray box model, pictured to the right, doesn't have the same phase or frequency issues as the black box model developed in this work, the output of the polynomial model that's on the left appears to follow the trajectory of the measured output much more closely. So as I mentioned before, I'll be continuing my work with modeling and system identification in the fall. I'll start by investigating the phase and frequency discrepancy between my model output and the measured output. I also plan on extrapolating some of the concepts that I explored here to estimate models for more complicated systems. This would include the Quanser AERO and its 2 degree of freedom multiple input, multiple output configuration. The additional input introduces some significant cross-coupling issues, and it necessitates multiple estimated models to adequately describe the entire system. Ultimately, I hope to use system identification concepts to model a quadcopter drone seated in a gyroscopic testbed, pictured in the middle here. The testbed limits the quadcopter drone to 3 degrees of freedom by restricting the drone's translational axes. So this concludes my presentation on the preliminary modeling of a 1 degree of freedom system using system identification procedures. Thank you for your time.